Well, we're going to do a good old-fashioned Catholic Bible study this morning with this beautiful gospel passage from the 21st chapter of the Gospel of John. You're welcome to follow along in your books. You don't need to. This reading, really, it's the end of the gospel, and it's pivotal, and it speaks so much to what God has for the church and for us. I've already explained to you that Peter had given up on his role as being an apostle. He had seen his leader be crucified, died, and yes, he saw him risen, but he just didn't understand. I think he told his disciples, you know what, gentlemen, it's been a good 3 years. It was a good run. I'm going back to the business. That's what they were doing. And so they go out fishing. And they fish all night and catch nothing. And of course they will catch nothing, because that's not what God has for them to do. When we live in the center of God's will, we will bear fruit in our lives, even though there may be suffering. When we don't live in the heart of God's will, even though we might have abundance, our lives are empty. And Jesus is going to now call Peter again in the same way he called him the first time, because Peter has walked away from his mission. And so do you remember how Jesus called Peter the first time? Do you remember that Jesus met Peter as Peter was by the shore of the sea mending his nets after fishing all night and having caught nothing? Remember that story? And Jesus says to Peter, his name was Simon in those days, Simon, put back out into the deep for a catch. But Master, I fished all night and caught nothing, but at your word I'll do it. And you remember the story. And he cast his nets, and a massive amount of fish were caught. So much so that Simon Peter fell at the knees of Jesus and said, depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. Because at that moment, Simon realized that Jesus was no ordinary man and that Jesus had a plan for him, and Peter did not feel worthy to be a part of it. He's like, I'm just a ruddy fisherman. Do you know how I talk out here in these boats? You want me to? I'm not your guy. And Jesus said, follow me, and I will make you a fisher of men. And he left everything and followed Jesus. And spent 3 years in formation with Christ. And so now Jesus is doing that exact same thing again with Peter. So I'm sure as Peter caught that fish, it was all coming back to him. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Don't walk away from Jesus, even though I don't understand it. And John tells us in the gospel this really interesting little note. They say, hey, it's the Lord on the shore. They finally recognize him, and it says that Peter tucked in his garments because he was lightly clad and jumped into the sea. That's Bible talk for saying he was naked. Can't say that in church. He tucked in his garments for his lightly clad. What is St. John trying to tell us with this passage? Again, the Gospels are so rich with deep meaning, because in the Gospel all you have are words. So you have to use words to the fullest extent you can. The Gospel of John begins, chapter 1, verse 1, with the words, in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. John is intentionally copying the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, in the beginning. Because John wants us to know that with this gospel is going to be a story parallel and surpassing the creation of the universe. That what God is going to do through this man Jesus is going to be an entirely new thing. A new creation, a new covenant. And God's mighty power is going to be at work in the same way it was when the world was created. And so now he's going to hint again back to the book of Genesis with Peter clothing himself to go see Jesus. Do you remember Adam and Eve in the garden? They were created and they were in total communion with God. God had entrusted the whole garden to them except for that one tree. Don't eat it. And the Bible tells us that Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed. And then they ate from the tree, and their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked. And when God came looking for them in the garden, they hid in the bushes and covered themselves with clothes because they were now ashamed. When we sin, the result of sin is shame. We recognize our otherness, and we have to cover up our parts that make us different from the other. And so Peter now, when he sees Jesus, he has to cover himself because he knows his shame. He denied the Lord to his face 3 times. And just like all sinful man, we cover ourselves. Isn't it true? The more we sin, the more we distance ourselves from God. How many people I know that they've sinned, they just say, I can't go to church anymore. I can't come here anymore. And it becomes distance and separation, covering, hiding. And Jesus is going to call Peter out of that. And it says that on the shore it's a charcoal fire. John puts that there because on Good Friday, the night Jesus was betrayed, Peter was standing around a charcoal fire when he denied the Lord 3 times. And so Jesus is going to bring Peter right back to that charcoal fire. Remember this fire, Peter? Not to shame him, but to reconcile him. The Lord in His mercy does not want to shame you, but sometimes we have to be brought back to our sinfulness and encounter it head on, that we can be forgiven from it and move forward, free from shame and guilt. That is why confession is so important for us, because we have to confront our guilt head on. It's very easy in the quiet of our room to go, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's really easy to do that. But that's not how Christ does it with people. He wants them to face it head on. Now I'm going to move down to where Jesus in this passage is going to have a talk with Peter to reconcile him. He's going to ask him if he loves him, and I need to preface this as I go through it. In Greek, there are 3 words for love. This gospel is written in the Greek language. I don't know if you know that or not. It's written in Greek. It wasn't written in English. Written in Greek. Greek has 3 words for love. English, we have 1 word for love. So our word love becomes kind of clumsy. I can say, I love God, I love my spouse, I love my children, I love pancakes. 1 word. In Greek, it's very textured. There's the word eros, which is the word that erotic comes from. Like the erotic dimension of marital love. It's not a bad thing. There's one dimension of love. Another word for love is philos, P-H-I-L-O-S. Philos means friendship, brotherly love. Like in a marriage, you have to be in deep friendship with your spouse. That's what philos means. Philadelphia is called the city of brotherly love. Philos, Philadelphia, that kind of brotherly love, friendship. But it's a real love. And then the third word for love is agape. Agape. And agape is self-sacrificial love. The kind of love where parents run into a burning building to save their children. You're willing to lay it all down kind of love. And you have to have all that kind of love for a healthy marriage. Eros, philos, and agape. I preface that because Jesus is going to use these words here. And if you don't know the Greek, and I'm going to explain it to you, then you're going to miss the meaning of this passage. Second is this, the way Jesus is going to call Peter by name. When Jesus confronts him with his sinfulness, he will not call him Peter. He will call him by his old name, and I'll show that to you. He will call him Simon, son of John. Because Peter doesn't sin. It is Simon who sins. Peter is the one whom he has called forth to be the head of the church. It is the old man in him who sinned. Just as you and I who have been baptized and confirmed, we are temples of the Holy Spirit. The very Spirit of God is in us. And when I sin, it's not the Spirit of God in me that sins. It's the old me who sins. The old me inside of myself turns my back, so to speak, against the Spirit inside of me, and I sin. Does that make sense? And Jesus is making that distinction with Peter. There is something at work in Peter that is very holy and godly, and that's not the part of him that denied Christ. It was his old sinful self that needs to be renewed and converted. So let me walk you through this. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He says this, "Do you agape me? Do you love me with a sacrificial love more than these?" And the question is, what are the these? Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these boats? More than your career? More than your worldly aspirations? More than what your comforts are? Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these apostles? Where is your love for me, Peter, head of the apostles? And Simon Peter answered him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I philos you." He does not use the word agape in response. Jesus says, "Do you agape me? Do you love me with a sacrificial love?" And Peter says, "Lord, you know that I have friendship for you." Peter does not respond with agape. Because Peter knows just a few days earlier, he had boldly proclaimed, "Lord, I will die for you. I'll never deny you." Only to deny him 3 times. So Peter now is humble, and he knows that he's not going to make claims for himself that he does not believe he can live up to. He is so humble, and he is just going to be open to the Lord. "Lord, this is all I can give you. I can't give you agape." And perhaps that's where you are in your walk with Jesus. We're all in a different place with him. What can you give God? Maybe that's all you can give. And is that okay? Well, we're going to see if that's okay. He said to Simon Peter a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you agape me?" Simon Peter answered him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I philos you." The Lord's trying to get him to live a sacrificial love and commitment for him, but Peter is not going there. I can't write checks that I can't cash anymore, Lord. Well, then tend my sheep. Jesus said to him a third time, now listen closely, "Simon, son of John, do you philos me?" Jesus now condescends. He humbles himself and says, "Fine then, Peter, can you at least be a friend? You can't live, you're not willing to live with sacrificial love. Can you at least give me philos? Can you at least do that?" And the scripture says, Peter was distressed that Jesus said to him a third time, "Do you philos me?" Because Peter heard the change. He recognized that Jesus stepped it down, lowered the bar. But here's the good news. Christ is willing to lower the bar. Because he lowered the bar infinitely when he left heaven and took on human flesh. Christ is willing to submit himself to anything for us, to become a slave. There is nothing too low for him. Christ is willing to meet you and I wherever we are. So wherever you are with your walk with God, you don't have to pretend to be something you're not. Allow Christ to meet you wherever you are. If your faith is only the size of a mustard seed, then offer that to Christ and let him meet you there. That's all he wants, is to meet us where we are. But then if we're honest and we allow Christ humbly like Peter into that place, then the transformation can really begin. Because the Lord works with humility and honesty. He can't work with false pride. And so he's going to accept Peter. And Peter will indeed become the head of the church. Peter, who's so humble. I think God chose Peter to be the head of the church because the first leader of the church was one who understands profoundly what it means to be a failure. So when early Christians would come to Peter and say, "Oh my gosh, I totally blew it," he'd say, "Yeah, I know, I understand. Pick yourself back up. God still loves you." And so that's who we are as a church. We are a church of mercy and redemption. We're not a church of perfection. We are called to perfection, but God meets us in our imperfection and draws us forward. And Peter would go forth, and would he live with agape love? Oh, you bet he would, as we heard in that first reading today. I will never stop preaching in the name. And the only way they could get Peter to stop talking about Jesus was literally to kill him. And I'm sure his dying breath was, Jesus. Jesus. So this is Peter's story. It's the church's story, and it's your story and mine. Again, I don't know where you are in your walk with Christ. Let Jesus meet you there. Be humble. Say, this is where I really am, Lord. And if you need to be reconciled, let His divine mercy reconcile you, to take away your shame. Christ isn't shaming you. He wants to remove your shame, remove your guilt, and restore you to the church. Oh, that's the good news. May God's blessings be upon you as this gospel story sinks deeper into your minds and your hearts.